Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
From trade and green development into innovation and security, we take a look at what Wang Yi's Nordic tour has achieved. New trading rules have taken effect across Chinese mainland stock exchanges, and a Japanese writer urges society to learn from wartime history and avoid returning to the path of militarism. Welcome to World Today, a news program with a different perspective. I'm Anna in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our top story. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has concluded his visit to Norway, the final stop of his Nordic tour. The trip, which has also included Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, has already generated a series of discussions on bilateral trade, green development, innovation, and security. So what tangible outcomes have emerged from these visits, and how significant are they for both the China-Nordic ties and the broader China-Europe relationship? To delve into this, joining us on the line is Hussein Askari, Vice President of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. Mr. Askari, since you are joining us from Sweden, let me begin with China-Sweden relations. Sweden was the first Western country to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China and remains China's largest trading partner in the Nordic region. How would you describe China-Sweden relations today, and what new momentum could this visit bring to the relationship?
I think this was a very important breakthrough. It showed that diplomacy still works in the world we have today. And it was a very, very interesting development, especially that this is the first visit by a Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs to Sweden in 22 years. The relationship between Sweden and China went through flows and ebbs in times. As you mentioned, Sweden was the first country to recognize the People's Republic of China in 1950. Also, very important for Sweden and the Nordic countries that they were actually in 2013 when China applied for observer membership in the Arctic Council. It was Sweden who was the chairman at the time, and Iceland and other Nordic countries who supported China's membership. So that was a very important. But then we had other situations where the relationship became a bit cooler, especially during the first Trump administration, which shows that the Swedish policy is also contingent on developments around the world. It's not simply a bilateral relationship. But we had, for example, the banning of the Huawei from the G5 licensing and building project in Sweden in 2020. Sweden, interestingly, as you said, it's a major economic power in the north. It's an industrial power, export-oriented, and therefore has been always for free trade and free flow of investments. But then suddenly, discussing security issues, they had to ban Huawei and other Chinese companies. Now they are restricting the operations of Chinese companies here in Sweden, even, or at least in the previous years. Even in the clean technology area, very successful Chinese companies established here in Sweden got very bad restrictions. The relationship has been going up and down, but in recent years, because of Chinese diplomacy, thanks to the Chinese embassy, the former ambassador Cui Aimin and the current ambassador Zhou Limin and their teams, they have made enormous advances by avoiding friction on disagreements and working together on common goals where China and Sweden agree. And these areas are economic cooperation, business-to-business relations, cultural relations, people-to-people cooperation, and academic cooperation. So the focus has been to avoid confrontation on disagreements, but work more intensively on agreements. And this is a great lesson in diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. Then with all these up and downs and challenges from geopolitical pressures, when you look at China and Sweden, what areas of cooperation are you most excited about after this visit? Where do you see the biggest opportunities going forward?
I think the focus of the visit and also the statements by both the Chinese embassy here, but also the Swedish foreign ministry and the coverage in the press is that the main area of cooperation will be economic cooperation, industrial innovation, and clean technology. And this is very, very important for Sweden because the whole EU industrial powers are suffering right now because increase in the cost of energy, increase in the supply chain disruptions, and China becoming the world's largest industrial system, also innovation system, is opening new windows of cooperation between Sweden and China. We have recently had a study by one of the major labor unions, their economists, especially in the machinery area. They said importing Chinese high quality input materials with a very good price are increasing the productivity of the whole Swedish industrial system because we take these inputs and then incorporate them in our finished goods, and we raise the added value greatly, which increases the income and productivity of the Swedish workers and companies. The other area is in the innovation area because China has become, unlike before, as a massive producer, now it's a quality innovation hub. Therefore, all the major Swedish companies like SKF, Ericsson, Elekta, all the major technology companies are moving their research and development centers globally to China because that's where you have a fantastic skill level, well-educated engineering, human resources, but also supply chains and industrial chains, which can both produce and test the new products these companies innovate, but also they can use the enormous Chinese market as a great opportunity for them. So instead of China being a risk, it's becoming an opportunity for the Swedish industries.
We know following Sweden, Denmark became the second Western country to recognize China. This time, during Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit, the Danish Foreign Minister highlighted the Danish Parliament had adopted a resolution supporting the One China policy. How do you interpret this political signal? And how do you view the relationship between China and Denmark today?
Yeah, I think the Danish are making also important steps forward in the diplomatic relations with China. I mean, this is a very good signal, but also, like Sweden, they are very much interested in the Chinese market, but also politically, because this is where the touchy issues are. Politically, there is a lot of disagreement, but this move shows that even on the political level, China's demands for respect for its sovereignty, internal affairs, and position in the world is being recognized. And therefore, the Danish parliament, but also others, are insisting that it should be the policy. Now, the problem comes is when these nations are not sovereign nation states, so to speak. They are members of the European Union, which has taken away some of the decision-making policies from the local parliaments, from the local governments, and therefore they have to adapt to EU policies and regulations, which are becoming more and more because the EU is too much integrated into the NATO, and their relationship to the United States, which goes up and down, affects a lot of the policies of the EU, which are also imposed on the member nation states. And therefore, when these nations discuss geopolitical issues with China, they say, we are part of the EU. We cannot take decisions on our own. But that the fact that the Danish parliament on its own can take such a decision is a very good signal that these nations also have different views and different policies they want to advance together with China.
Then let's move to Finland. A Finnish president, Stubb, also expressed interest in expanding cooperation in emerging sectors such as the green economy and artificial intelligence. What makes Finland a unique partner in these fields? How much potential do you see for deeper cooperation between the two?
I think Finland has a very great tradition of supporting international diplomacy and being also a very ferociously independent nation. Even in the face of great powers, it's very important that the Finnish president is recognizing the fact that cooperation with China in these areas is very crucial for Finland also as a technology-based economy, innovation-based economy. And I think what this also signals shift not only in the Finnish policy or Swedish policy, but we are seeing a shift in the EU policy, which I call the traffic light model, which already in 2018, 2019, designated China as first as a partner, economic partner, two as a competitor, and three as a strategic rival. So this makes it almost impossible to deal with China because you have all these three contradictory things all at the same time. It's like sitting in the traffic lights in your car, and when the traffic lights are lit, all the green, yellow, and red lights are on. So nobody knows, shall we go forward? Shall we stop? Who's going to go first? And this confusion has created a lot of disruption for the trade and investment cooperation between China and the EU countries and consequently the member states of the EU. And therefore, hopefully, this will end this traffic light model and regard China simply as an economic, trade, and investment partner to end this confusion.
Then building on that, at the final stop of the tour, China expressed its hope of signing a China-Norway free trade agreement at an early date. And Norway has been one of Europe's leader in areas like EV adoption, even though it's not an EU member. But at a time when the European Union's approach toward China has become more cautious, as you pointed out, how do you assess the prospects for China-Norway cooperation with this FTA?
Yeah, well, one advantage Norway has is its independence because it's not a member of the EU and therefore it can design its own policies. It's also financially in a much better position than the other EU countries. The EU countries are now under very deep corporate debt pressure and sovereign debt pressures. And therefore, Norway can actually follow certain policies that are beneficial for their own people. And therefore, they had opened up for the EV. They don't have an auto industry which can be affected by Chinese competition, and therefore it's not a big deal for them. They welcome this. They want to become a leader in the clean technology area, and therefore opening up for Chinese clean technology can open also new areas for cooperation. Like certain technologies can be produced in Norway itself to diversify their economy from the reliance on export of raw oil, which is the main source of wealth in Norway, into industrialization in these green areas. And therefore, they have much greater margin of freedom to decide their policy than other EU countries, where, for example, in Germany and Sweden, we have very powerful auto industry, which fears the competition from Chinese EV producers. So there's a certain difference in the different countries.
Then given what I've been talking about, some commentators have called this trip a mission to find common ground despite differences. Also, you made this point earlier. In your opinion, what makes the Nordic countries different from other parts of Europe when it comes to relations with China? And what role could China-Nordic ties play in the broader China-Europe relationship?
I think the Nordic countries have traditionally been very much in support of the multilateral system. We had many leaders of the United Nations, like general secretaries from the Nordic countries, from Norway, Sweden, Finland. Finland and Sweden were involved in many diplomatic initiatives of global importance, like the meetings between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. We had the Oslo negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians in Norway. Sweden also was host to many international peace and negotiations initiatives. So these countries have this tradition both of being very independent, but also working for peace and a multilateral system. This changed, unfortunately, in recent years because of the geopolitical tension with Russia, for example, but also consequently US-China competition, so to speak, affected those countries. And now we have all the Nordic countries are members of except Iceland, are members of NATO. And therefore they have to adjust to the new realities they find themselves in. But I think they have a unique tradition, historical tradition of staying away from conflicts of the big powers, but also trying to play a role. Although they are small nations, they can play a big role in the world. And I think this is a good advantage for these countries and which differentiate them from others.
Thanks for those analysis. That was Hussein Askeri, Vice President of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. This is Road Today. Stay with us.
Welcome. I am Chu Zhang, Deputy Director at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. On the World Today program, we will dive beyond the headlines to uncover the stories, trends, and impacts that connect states across the globe. Join me on World Today.
You've been listening to World Today. Let's move to China's capital markets, where new trading rules have taken effect across Chinese mainland stock exchanges. The Shanghai and Shenzhen bourses are seeing the most notable changes, which focus on expanding after-hour trading and unifying price limits for special treatment stocks to improve market pricing efficiency and liquidity. The reform are another step in aligning China's capital markets with international standards, making it easier for overseas investors to participate. For more on this, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, a professor of economics at Willamette University.
So, Yan, first, let's start with the basics. What are the most important changes under the new trading rules? And what do they tell us about the next stage of China's capital market development?
Well, there are three major changes. The first one is extended the hours of trading for the after-hour fixed price trading has been extended to cover all the A-shares and also the ETFs. The second change is the daily price change limits for the main board stocks under the so-called special treatment or risk warning status have been raised from previous 5% to now 10%. And the third major change is that it now switched the trading mechanism for the funds during the closing period from the so-called continuous auction to now closing call auction. And so the closing price officially will be generated through this call option process. So these three important changes, I think mostly are to attract foreign investors, improve the efficiency of pricing in the stock markets, also to be more compatible with the global or the international practice. So in a way to harmonize some of these regulatory framework with international markets. So these are really to encourage the long-term development of the Chinese stock markets.
And one goal of these reforms is to improve market efficiency and pricing. So how do you expect the new trading framework to influence investors' behavior, particularly in encouraging a shift from short-term speculation towards more rational and long-term investing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, first of all, when you unify and also expand the price limits, as I mentioned earlier, on the risk-warned stocks, the rule then immediately exposed the speculative, the so-called penny stocks, to sharper and also more transparent pricing. And so what this does is it encourages a shift from more emotion-based retail trading to more trading based on fundamental analysis. So this is one way to try to curb these speculations and encourage more, long-term fundamental-based trading. And second is it helped to encourage institutional portfolio investment. Now, the reason for that is because when you expand after-hour trading, it helps investors and fund managers to adjust their large portfolios without causing a lot of erratic single intraday swings during the standard trading hours. So just these two important changes, I think, help to stabilize the market, improve the pricing efficiency, and reduce incentives to have the speculative tradings. And I think, again, this is one recent sort of reforms that would help to improve the market. But there is also many other longer term, there are other comprehensive reforms that I think also move towards this goal.
And for a bigger picture, China's equity markets delivered a strong first half of the year. So what have been the defining themes driving the market performance? Which sectors stood out the most?
Well, I think that, China has been doing great in terms of technological innovations, especially in the recent years, in terms of the new trails, the green technologies, and also in terms of AI developments. And I think these kinds of technological innovations and the broader economic revival since the pandemic, I think that really is the fundamental reasons that attract many of the global investors. But of course, I think that there are other factors. For example, the Chinese stock market still remained relatively underweighted for many of the global funds. And also the valuation is very attractive because of the previous underweight positions. And for example, Standard Chartered Bank recently, they released the global market outlook, and they recommend an overweight position on Chinese stocks, focusing on China's technology and telecommunication service industries. So that's an example that the stock market reflects the broader, structural shift in China's economies, more technological developed and more innovative. And the other, I think, major encouraging factor is, like we just mentioned, which is the regulatory changes. The Chinese policymaker intentionally wanted to improve market efficiency, but at the same time to set up guardrails to make sure that, for example, foreign investors do not have the access to derivatives, and also to crack down some of the illicit offshore brokers. So all of this are trying to improve the orderly and efficient functioning of the stock market. So giving all the three macroeconomic fundamentals and the structural innovation of the economy, given the current positions of the global funds, and given the regulatory and policy changes, I think those are the three major factors would attract foreign investors. As far as the sectors is concerned, I think tech is the main focus. But I think as China's service consumption continue to grow in a very strong momentum, I think that would also continue to attract more investors.
And AI has been one of the biggest structural themes for China's equity market so far this year. So if we look across the AI value chain, where do you see the most opportunities?
Well, I think there are many opportunities along the way. From the most upstream, when you think about AI, is really powered by energy. So when it comes to the energy sector, as China continue to make the green transition in great stride, I think the energy sector remain a bright spot. Then you have the midstream with many of these chip manufacturing sectors. Semiconductor fabrication, design, and machinery. And this sector would also see continuous growth. I think an example is the global market, especially in South Korea. Many of these chip manufacturing and accessory industries have seen a boom. I think that also remain a bright spot in China. Then it comes to downstream, which I think is where China, the unique advantage is. When other countries are really trying to focus on the AI models, what China has been focusing on is really the AI plus strategy, which is to develop the AI embodied products and services. So in other words, AI will be integrated into many of the products. Think about, smart devices and autonomous drivings and many other applications, robotics. And so these downstream, in terms of AI embodied products, would also see really strong momentum. So I would say across the AI industry, the ecosystem, from the upstream, midstream to the downstream, I think they will continue to, not only power China's economic growth, but also provide really bright opportunities for investors as well.
And China's capital markets are playing a much bigger role in financing technology, green energy, and other strategic industries, reducing the company's reliance on traditional bank loans. So how significant is this shift, and what does it mean for the long-term competitiveness of China's innovation economy?
Well, I think this is a great progress. In the past, I think China's more bank-centered financing model has been really great to promote investments, but at the same time, it also tends to build up corporate debt. So now when you introduce a bigger role for the equity market, I think that helped provide diversified sources of financing for businesses. So when you are able to develop a stock market, an equity market that is really long-term oriented, that is productive, driven instead of, for financial speculations, I think that would greatly help to promote, efficient financing, productive financing for real economy. So again, I think the Chinese regulators are really striking for a balance, right? On the one hand, make sure the stock market, all these financial markets are oriented towards productive purposes, really using the finance to fund long-term and also, innovative undertakings. Instead of engaging in the short-term speculative kind of transactions. But on the other hand, trying to harmonize the regulations with with international practices, and also encourage especially the tech companies to be listed to raise funds in the equity market, use the equity market efficiently to support their long-term investments. So I think those two sides have to go together for the equity market to continue to play a positive role in promoting, economic development and technological development.
That was Yan Liang, a professor of economics at Willamette University, speaking with Zhao Yang. More to come. Japanese writer urges society to learn from wartime history and avoid returning to the path of militarism. China urges respect for Pacific Island nations' sovereignty and rejects bloc confrontation. Space computing takes off in Beijing with a new innovation center. You're listening to Road Today. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back to Road Today with Mika Anna in Beijing. As China marked the 98th anniversary of the July 7th incident that marked the start of Japan's full-scale invasion of China and China's whole nation resistance against Japanese aggression during the Second World War, questions surrounding historical memory and wartime responsibility remain highly relevant today. Japanese writer Yasushige Hanaika says he hopes that the Japanese society can learn from the experiences of wartime perpetrators, reflect on history, and avoid repeating the same path. The writer helped preserve and publish the memory of Yoshio Tsuchiya, who documented his crimes in China after the war and urged future generations not to follow the path of militarism. Hanaika says very few wartime perpetrators spoke openly about their crimes.
Among the perpetrators, very few people, like Mr. Tsuchiya, spoke openly about the crimes they committed. If it were me, I might have shifted the blame to others, buried the crimes in my heart, and remained silent. But he revealed all the crimes he had committed, which I think was remarkable. I also understand that war not only changes buildings and landscapes, but also destroys people's hearts. That is why I believe war must absolutely be avoided.
The Japanese writer also says Japan's recent moves toward remilitarization have given him a growing sense of urgency.
Japan is beginning to lose restraint, moving closer to war. Through legal revisions, not only in security but across various laws, the country is stepping closer toward war. However, too many people today do not understand war because those who experienced it firsthand are gradually passing away. That is why I hope the Japanese people can take a firm stance and raise their voices to stop war. Otherwise, I fear something very serious will happen. I hope everyone can understand this.
So for more on the importance of remembering history and the ongoing debate over historical accountability, we are joined today by Yang Xiyu, Research Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Yeah.
This year marks 89 years since the July 7th incident, a turning point that led to China's nationwide resistance against Japanese aggression. Even today, questions about wartime history, responsibility, and reflection remain deeply relevant. At a time when the world is facing more uncertainty and security tensions, why is it still important for us, to remember this history, and what lessons should we take from that history today?
It's a very critical and important question, not only facing the Chinese people, but also facing the Asian people as a whole. Everyone knows July 7th is not the turning point of the China-Japan relation in 1930s, but also was the turning point between Japan and the Asian region as a whole, simply because after Japan launched the full-scale invasion of China by July 7th, then followed by invasion from China to throughout Asia. Unfortunately, up to now, Japanese government and many of Japanese fail to have a right acknowledgement about history. All the people that the lesson is in 1930s, it was Japan that broke the international rules and orders and launched the invasion wars against the Asian people. And now they are doing the similar things without right acknowledgement of the history, breaking the rules and the international orders towards remilitarization. It's sad. Those who fail to learn from history doomed to repeat it. So I'm very worried, and many people are worried the current trends of Japan. So for Asian people, historical memory about July 7th is not the historical events memory, but that contains significant meanings to today's situation. You mentioned strategic instabilities and uncertainties are fast rising, especially now in Northeast Asia. So the more uncertainties, the more actions breaking rules and orders, the more importance and significance for us to firmly remember what the history tells us. Therefore, the July 7th is not the historical turning point at that time, but also put us at a crossroad towards the sustainable peace and stability, or repeat what we suffered from the history.
Indeed. But we see some former Japanese wartime perpetrators later acknowledge their actions and express their remorse, but many others choose silence. What does this contrast reveal about the broader historical attitudes and the social debates within Japan regarding wartime responsibility?
I think one of the most important reasons is, unlike Germany, Japan failed to conduct a peace reform after World War II because of broke out for Korean War. Everyone knows after the Tokyo judgment, quite a number of war criminals were sentenced. But because of the Cold War came, U.S. stopped the peace reform for Japan. The implemented peace reform put a root for the right wings in Japan's politics. More than half century in Japan, such wrong acknowledgement about history remain and growing simply because of the incompletion of the peace reform. And nowadays, the right-wing governments of Japan, generation by generation, try every effort to revise the history, re-educate the Japanese majority about the wrong historical acknowledgement. So in short, based on the historical reason and the current political operation, I have to say the majority of Japanese society fail to have the right acknowledgement about history. That's not only dangerous for Asia, but also the dangerous for Japan's future.
The Japanese writer says Japan's recent push toward remilitarization has made him increasingly concerned about repeating past mistakes. There is a view argued that Japan's growing emphasis on external security threats and geopolitical tensions is partly aimed at shaping public opinion and diverting attention from domestic challenges, including, economic difficulties and social issues. How do you assess this argument?
I think the so-called external threats for Japan is a political excuse for the current Japanese administration, for Japanese right wings towards the remilitarization. As you mentioned, actually, Japanese economy suffered more and more about debt burdens. But under such a situation, the current administration remains just like a previous administration, increasing their military budgets by making the so-called threats to Japan. Actually, the increased budget, combining the revising the peace institution, are designed to remilitarize Japan, revise pacifist path for Japan. Therefore, such political operation by the fanning up the so-called threats to Japan, added by the increasing military budget, added by the constant revision of the peace institutions for Japan, accelerate the course of the remilitarization for Japan. Therefore, now Japan has been on a wrong track towards a very dangerous direction, not only for Japan, but also for Asia as a whole.
Thanks for those in-depth analysis. That was Yang Shiyu, Research Fellow at China Institute of International Studies. China is urging relevant countries to respect the independence and sovereignty of Pacific Island nations, supporting their sustainable development and avoid targeting any third party. The comments came after Australia and Fiji signed a new defense agreement, which some observers have linked to concerns over China's growing presence in the region. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning says China's cooperation with Pacific Island countries is based on mutual respect and their development needs. She stressed that China does not engage in geopolitical rivalry or pursue narrow political interests in the region. So for more on this, we're joined by Professor Chen Hong, Director of Australian Studies Center at East China Normal University. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Yes, thank you.
Professor, a lot of Western coverage has framed the Australia-Fiji Defense Pact as a move to push back against China's influence in the region. So how convincing is the narrative that China is somehow shrinking other countries like Australia's security interests in the region?
Not at all. The narrative that China is crowding out other countries in the Pacific, I think is strategically manufactured. China is not shutting anyone out. It is giving Pacific Island countries more development partners, more economic options, and more diplomatic room to maneuver. So the real issue is not China's presence, but whether some traditional powers can accept that Pacific countries are no longer willing to be treated as exclusive spheres of influence. Fiji has made its position unmistakably clear. Prime Minister Rambuka said clearly that the new treaty does not threaten Fiji's relationship with China, and that Australia's enemies are not necessarily automatically Fiji's enemies. So that is the language, I think, of sovereignty, not bloc politics.
Could you elaborate why does Australia seem so eager to present this partnership as part of a larger strategic response to China? Because as you said, Fiji has been pretty clear that this agreement doesn't change its relationship with China and that it wants to keep an independent foreign policy, right?
Yeah, I think actually Australia has always treated or regarded the neighboring, Pacific Island country area as its own backyard. This kind of backyard mentality has been setting the tone for its policies. So Australia regards the Pacific Island countries as its own, members of its influence, so that actually it can exert its influence, exert its powers upon those countries. I think that is actually the fundamental principle that actually has been shaping Australia's policies. That is why I think Australia takes such a vigilant attitude towards China, thinking that China would be threatening its position in the South Pacific region. But China has made it very clear that China intends to taking inclusive policy rather than the exclusivity. That is actually what Australia and some other countries have been doing.
Professor, when Pacific leaders talk about their biggest challenges, they usually mention climate change, development, jobs, and infrastructure, not military threats. So is there a risk that all this focus on defense cooperation, misses what Pacific Island countries actually care about most? And from Fiji's perspective, how necessary is this agreement in practical terms?
I think actually both for Fiji and Australia, they do have their own, strategic defense priorities, security concerns. But actually, I think especially for the Pacific Island countries, the most important prioritized item on its agenda of security is climate change, development, rather than to be putting itself upon the chessboard of big power contestation. So actually, I think this is actually totally against the Pacific Island countries' own national interest and also its own long-term strategy. So that actually, I think this is actually what the Pacific Island countries has been thinking about, Australia's policies. That is why I think actually why Australia has been trying to push itself into any arrangement that has been established between, for example, China and also Pacific Island countries, so that actually it can try to sabotage such a kind of a cooperation framework, to be making it to be sort of like destabilizing any kind of cooperation arrangements.
Australia has strengthened defense cooperation across the region while also advancing initiatives linked to AUKUS, including the future deployment of nuclear-powered submarines, right? At the same time, it frequently criticizes China's activity in the Pacific as geopolitical maneuvering. Is this double standards? What's the real difference between China's approach and Australia's approach in the region?
I think the difference between China's approach and Australia's approach is quite clear. China's stated model is based on development cooperation, mutual benefits, openness, and non-exclusivity. It does not require Pacific countries to antagonize and alienate another partner in order to work with China. But for Australia, by contrast, Australia has been embedding its regional engagement within a wider military and alliance-based strategy linked to its security partnership with the United States and its broad agenda. In particular, as you said, AUKUS. That is why Canberra's criticism of China is deeply contradictory, self-contradictory. Australia calls Chinese cooperation geopolitical maneuvering, while itself has been building formal defense alliance itself, expanding military access and encouraging regional security alignments of its own. Pacific Island countries, should judge every partner by one standard. So does it respect sovereignty, deliver development, and avoid demanding political loyalty?
There is an argument, you also mentioned this earlier, that Australia's real concern is not just the security, is that Pacific Island countries are becoming more independent and are building relationships with a wider range of partners, including China. How should we understand this from a Global South perspective?
The argument that Australia is struggling to adjust to a more diversified regional order, I think it is correct. Pacific Island countries are no longer passive recipients of aid or objects of strategic competition. They are actively diversifying partnerships, bargaining harder and refusing to accept binary choices between China and Australia or between China and the United States. I think this is a healthy development for the Global South. The real test for Australia is whether it can accept Pacific autonomy without treating such as a security threat. Mature regional policy would compete through better climate support, stronger infrastructure cooperation, and genuine respect for local priorities. It would not demand that Pacific Island countries prove their loyalty by limiting their ties with China. So the future of Pacific must be built upon partnership, not patronage, and on development, not exclusion.
Thanks for those insightful analysis. That was Professor Chen Hong, Director of Australian Studies Center at East China Normal University. Beijing has unveiled a Space Computing Innovation Center, aiming to become a global hub for emerging space computing field. The center was launched at a recent forum held in the Chinese capital. Space computing means moving data centers into orbit and letting satellites process data in space. It's China's first center dedicated to connecting the whole industrial chain in space computing. It focuses on 6 key areas, including space-native computing chips and high-performance payloads. Why is China betting big on computing power in space? What challenges are lying ahead? And what could it mean for the digital economy? For more on this, let's have my colleague Gao Yingshi in the studio. Welcome, Yingshi.
Thanks for having me.
You should help us understand first what's space computing and how would you describe the current state of this space computing industry worldwide? Is this still an early stage experimental field, or are we seeing it move forward, toward a real commercial use?
Well, actually, the concept of space computing isn't as complicated as it sounds. Well, think about where all our computing lives today. So it's on the ground in a giant building full of servers. Space computing just means like moving those data centers up into the orbit. So satellites can collect, process, and store data right there in space instead of sending everything back down to Earth. And traditional model was that you collect the data in the sky, will compute on the ground. A satellite would take the pictures, gather the data, and then send the huge volumes of raw data back to the Earth for processing. The problem is that takes time and it eats up bandwidth. So space computing flips that around. You put the computing power right next to where the data is created, so the satellites can process it and run AI analysis on the spot. For things like disaster response, that speed makes a real difference. And as for what stage we are currently at, so my read is that it's moving from the concept and the discussion into a kind of a full-scale engineering and commercialization. And this has become a kind of a global race. We all know that Elon Musk and his company SpaceX has plans to deploy up to 1 million satellites in the low Earth orbit. We also see that EU is researching on the orbit data centers, and China is actually ahead on the speed of engineering and commercialization. Last May, China launched a space computing satellite constellation, and it achieved the inter-satellite networking and deployed and verified an AI model in the orbit. And this kind of commercial service has already begun. The first paying institutional clients are on the board. So I think it's no longer just a pure lab concept. It's more like how do we do this efficiently and at large scale?
As you said, space computing is the deployment of computing infrastructure in space. Then what problems does that technology actually solve that ground-based data center cannot?
Well, that's the key question. The short answer is that the data centers on the ground are hitting some kinds of hard limits, and the space happen to solve exactly those problems. The first and most practical is the energy and land. As AI explodes, demand for computing power is rising quickly. Like one projection says that from 2024 to 2030, electricity use by China's data centers will grow around like 20% a year. So it's far outpacing overall electricity demand. So ground data centers face very real constraints. We have limited land, tight power supply, while space, on the other hand, has basically an inexhaustible supply of solar energy. It's a kind of a natural green power source. And space computing can push energy efficiency close to this kind of a theoretical limit with almost kind of zero carbon emissions. So it can provide kind of a low-cost green computing for energy-hungry tasks like training large AI models. Second is the real-time performance. Data generated in space from remote sensing, weather, and so on is slow and bandwidth heavy if it has to come back to the Earth first. So computing directly in orbit dramatically improves the real-time performance and it eases the transmission load. Some experts estimate that this alone can save the whole system kinds of billions of dollars a year. So, and also there's a security concern. So if all of your important data has to be processed on the ground or maybe in the servers in another country, that's a real risk. Well, handling it yourself up in space, that keeps it safer. And because satellites, constellation, it's spread out, it's hard to jam and hard to knock out. So that also makes the backup you can lean on for emergency communications and disaster relief. So, and these kinds of, there's another problem and easy to overlook. So nobody wants one of those kind of data centers next door. So it's what people call the NIMBY effect, not in my backyard. Everyone wants AI and its services that data centers make possible. But the data centers themselves are big, noisy, power hungry, and it drinks up a lot of water for cooling. So local communities often push back when one is planned nearby. So that makes like good sites harder and harder to find. So moving those kind of centers up to sky can solve these questions easily. And all those combined together, all this ground data center struggle to solve all at once, and space computing offers kind of a whole new approach.
We know the rise of AI has created a massive demand for computing power. Then how can space computing support the AI industry, especially what could it mean for the broader AI economy going forward?
Well, that makes, but they make each other better. Well, start with AI needs. Big models are everywhere now, chatting, writing, with all kinds of smart apps. And every bit of that runs on computing power. And people in the industry talks about the token economy, where demands for compute is climbing so fast that we can't build data centers on the ground quickly enough to keep up. So put simply, AI's appetite is starting to outrun what we can build here on Earth. That's what makes space, with its unlimited solar power, such an exciting place to add our capacity. And also, like AI makes space computing far more valuable. So satellites generate massive amounts of data and orbit, remote sensing, like for instance, a very high. At very high volumes, without AI up there to make those sense of it. It's just a pile of raw footage. But with AI on board, the satellites can figure out itself what actually matters and send you the answer, not just the raw data. So what does this mean for AI economy? Well, the biggest thing is it will create a whole new companies, new products. Well, we see that in 3G internet gives us WeChat. Or 4G and 5G, we have the TikTok. Once like satellite, internet, and space computing are really built out, they will grow apps we can't even picture yet. So some people call this kind of a commercial spaceflight 2.0. So phase 1 is building the roads. Phase 2 is all business like spring up along them. So it isn't just a space story. It will kind of a real engine.
Thanks, Yingshi, for those valuable explanation. That was my colleague Gao Yingshi. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. I'm Anna in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.